So we're software guys that understand the energy business. And we actually go out into the field. If you look on our website, you see pictures of guys in hard hats, ladies in hard hats. Those are our folks. That's not stock photography. We really do go out. We have entrance hard hats. We want to understand how the operations of the business work, and ultimately we feel like that helps us make better decisions and help our clients make better decisions. Starting with what's the people doing the real work? What does that look like? Some of our upstream clients. You'll see Memorial up here as a new client, but right, got a couple dozen of upstream clients, some folks that you might recognize as a sampling. So let's talk about sort of frac your data. What is this? What do we mean by that? And what we mean really is increasing the flow of information rather than, we're all familiar with the idea of a siloed system. You guys have heard the term siloed information or information silos before. Maybe you've seen a diagram of something like this with sort of these kind of cans of information. You think about them scattered throughout the organization. We sort of take that one step further and imagine kind of the idea of an information seal. In other words, barriers that are stopping the information flowing to the people who need it. And we think about, when we say frac your data, what we mean is there a way to produce more useful information for people by allowing that information to flow across what those siloed boundaries might be? So they could be department boundaries, they could be systems boundaries, right? And ultimately what we want to produce is insight. And insight just means the ability to make a better decision, right? You have insight into what to do next. You know, I should go this way, I should buy this, I should send this email, I should make this decision. So that's ultimately what we want to do, and how we produce value for people, is helping them take the information already in their business and produce insight as to what to do next from a decision perspective. So we actually made an infographic here that illustrates typical roles in an upstream company and how they're affected by information. So everything from the COO, sort of at the top of the food chain, on down, the Director of Revenue Accounting, VP of Ops, Director of HSC, Drilling Manager, and we have down here Phil, who's our Director of Land. So we create sort of a persona for each person. We have Elaine over here, Chief Reservoir Engineer, but this just illustrates how are these roles as kind of archetypes of typical roles you'd find in an upstream company, how are they affected by information? So today we're going to kind of look at what is a typical Phil looking at. And we see, today we see kind of polarization. We see like high values in liquids plays, and we see the effect of commodity price pressure on gas plays, and we see the pressures that come in to land as a result of those things. There's the speed to go and take acreage and exploit acreage and hold acreage and where you're trying to develop your liquids. And then there's also this issue of how do we hold our positions in gas plays until such a time as we can monetize them in some other way. Drive costs down, spin them off, discover liquids opportunities there, etc. So what we're talking about today is how do we take the information in our business and use it by allowing it to get to the people who need to consume it to make better decisions. So we talked about our term for that is frac your data, and that's just a way to illustrate that information flowing across the organizations. We're talking about our sort of sample Director of Land here, Phil, and what he's dealing with. And a lot of times another trend we see is this growing complication of provisions in shale leases especially, and the divergence from the standard lease idea, which has been a lot more common in the past, but is increasingly less common that there's any idea of what a standard lease is, as if there ever really was a standard lease. But the standard 8/8 lease is not something that we see a lot of being written, especially in shale plays where landowners have strong control to negotiate. So we'll talk about an example of how this plays out. So cheated out of millions. You guys may have seen in Houston. There's an attorney here who started off with 18-wheeler racks, and then he's BPO spill, and now if you look on his website, he's actually doing. I'm not sure this website's even around anymore, or this guy's even around anymore, but I remember there was that on I-10, and there was one right over the Galleria for like 18 months, maybe 2 years. There was that billboard. We just took a picture of it. You go on this guy's, he's litigating oil and gas royalties, mineral lease rights, you know, and these plaintiffs' attorneys. In fact, 2 of the presentations at the AAPL annual tech meeting at Haynes and Boone this year were on the emergence of lease busting plaintiffs' attorneys, and that they're getting better. These aren't just you know, ambulance chasers who decide to go into the land world. They're now actually understanding, they're learning the lingo, they're finding the weak points, they're getting some case history under their belt, and starting to produce some results. And there was some concerns and some talks about from some land attorneys about how do we deal with these sort of lease busters.
We were in that same seminar.
Oh, were you? Okay, great. Have you already heard this talk?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, great. Great. Well, I hope not a lot of it is totally duplicative, but this little segment might be.
Okay.
But here's a quote from his website, which is really sort of how do we entice landowners to try and find weak points and exploit you know, vaguenesses in their leases, which have traditionally been good relationships between lessors and lessees, and you know, sort of being enticed away with the idea of new bonus payments. Leasing to people who will do more aggressive exploration or exploitation of their property, you know, what their neighbors are getting in terms of royalty checks and things like that. If you did a Google search here, you might find, you know, 1 million results on oil and gas royalty lawyer. You know, now obviously all of those aren't oil and gas royalty lawyers, but the idea of there's a trend here going on, and so, you know, is this real? Are people really being sued? This is a little bit of an older from 2012, but you know, Chesapeake, they're always in the news getting sued by some landowner over some, you know, lease stipulation, and I don't mean to pick on them, but this is just a quote from a news article on the Business Journal here around just the increasing land lease litigation activity that's going on. If you looked, I think it was 2 weeks ago in the Business Journal, Burleson wrote, it was Burleson or it was, or maybe it was Baker Botts. They both had articles side by side about oil and gas litigation trends, and one of them, I don't remember whether it was Burleson's or whether it was Baker Botts' article, was about landowner litigation trends and how that's been the largest activity in their entire oil and gas practice in the Eagle Ford. So it's not a new concept, this idea of complying with your leases. And you know, one of the challenges, though, as we move into these new geographies, is that there's a wider variety of current standing oil and gas law maturity, court positions on the energy business in general, the variance between standardization of leases and length of leases and complexity of leases. You know, from residential single-page type leases, I'm oversimplifying, but you know, in the Barnett to Eagle Ford, we've got 85-page leases with all kinds of hair on it. And then we already talked about, but the plaintiffs' lawyers are getting better, and you're seeing specialists emerge that are sort of focused around freeing acreage for the purpose of rebonusing and releasing that land. Obviously, the risks here, lease jeopardy. We don't see that as much, but certainly litigation around lease jeopardy, right? You may or may not lose the actual lease, but you might have to fight to go get it or settle or pay out some sort of fee to maintain that lease that you wouldn't have to otherwise. Fees, compensatory royalties, litigation, and then time. You know, the time distraction factor for businesses that are like focused on drilling programs. Hate to see capital move into this sort of defensive posture that we see. This is a quote from Gary Evans that I don't. Were any of you at go to the TIPRO annual meetings? This is a quote from 2 years ago. Actually, he was one of the speakers, and he said, "You feel like you've got a gun to your head. You've got to drill a well, or you're going to lose a lease." Talking about the lengths that operators are going to hang on to acreage in certain places. So that's sort of the backstory. We want to talk about 3 best practices that we see with our clients, and also that we see that are possible, which is, number 1, develop a mitigation strategy. Number 2, so if you know that there's risk, number 1, let's have a strategy to mitigate that risk. Number 2 is let's look at how we're tracking the provisions in our leases which are leading to that risk, and look at are the tools that we have in place to manage this type of information up to date with the data and the quantity and the complexity of the information that they're supposedly managing. And then number 3 is eliminating the data silos which hold the information necessary to assess compliance. So we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So number 1 is developing a mitigation strategy. So this one is a little bit high level, but it's going to vary depending on where your assets are. Did you write your own leases? Did you inherit these leases, which is more common, of course? But quantifying the risks, right, that you're looking to mitigate, and then determining a timeline over which you need to create this mitigation strategy. Number 2, doing some sort of lease review or audit. I mean, obviously, some firms are going to be in a better position than others as far as how well documented their leasehold is, meaning which leases have which provisions. And I don't think that a standard rental clause is what we're talking about here, which most land systems track that pretty well. But we're talking about custom leases especially, and you have complex provisions, or where you have even common law duties, right? Implied duties that you don't have the information to even know that you're complying with. For example, offset liabilities. We'll talk about a little bit more of that in a moment. But actually reading the leases and documenting what it is that they contain in a way more than just comments. Number 3 is understanding what are the information gaps. So if you have a continuous drilling clause, your land administration people are supposed to be assessing compliance with that continuous operations clause. Do they even have the drilling data? Do they have the rig movement data? Do they even know a way to actually assess that compliance? So understanding what are those information gaps, and then we always suggest partnering with IT to address them as opposed to trying to standing up your own solution. Did you have something to add there?
No.
No? Okay.
I just love it when you mention IT.
When we mentioned
Every time the ears start cutting, right? Oh, that's I do that.
Well, the reason we say that is because what we do see is a lot of folks feel orphaned or that they don't have access to those IT resources, especially in the land department, which isn't maybe a traditionally sort of tech sophisticated department. And we see a lot of we'll build our own solution, which ultimately is Excel spreadsheet sitting on someone's desktop. It's not accessible, and sort of the status quo is.
That's not best practices?
Land management spreadsheet is sort of the state of the art for anything that's not managed by your lease system. So whatever your lease system of record is, whether it's Excalibur or Bolo or something else, whatever's outside of that box, oftentimes what we see is Excel. So the mitigation strategy. So number 2 is looking at how do we actually track our provisions. So I already started talking about this a little bit, but outdated software, the land software that's out there to a large part, and we're starting to see this turn around. In other words, the vendors that sell applications into the land department are starting to accommodate more and more what I'll say are relevant lease structures. But there's always going to be some parts that are out of the box, and what are we doing to track that? The status quo, again, Excel spreadsheets, manual types of reporting. In other words, we have a client that there's one landman, and he keeps a spreadsheet, and it's just sitting on his laptop, and every now and then he's like, oh, I haven't looked at that spreadsheet in a while. I better go visit. So he'll fire out some emails to drilling and say, hey, have we drilled this lease? When was the last time? Is that rig still operating? And he'll just sort of manually run through them. And maybe he doesn't find out when new leases get executed or acquired. Maybe he gets all of them, maybe he doesn't, and he gets to run through and capture those provisions that he needs to be tracking. And it's just a very inexact, imprecise type of system, which surprisingly has severe implications if it isn't executed well. So what we're suggesting is moving towards some sort of digital notification-based system which allows you to be proactively notified when a risk may be realized in advance of the risk rather than after the risk has already been realized. In other words, rather than waiting until you're outside your 30-day continuous operations clause and again getting a notification, either through an attorney or a landowner inquiry or even a report that you go run, but instead having a system that is aware of that continuous operations window, proactively notify the person in charge of administering that lease so that you can go and work with operations and say, do we intend to hold this lease? What's our plan? Do we need to look at our rig schedule? You know, maybe there's already planning underway, but so that collaboration can take place.
Do you have any way of monitoring your shut-in payments, I mean, your time or well shut-in?
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll actually talk about that. But what does that require? Again, as we talked about, what one of the bottlenecks was, it's getting that data. Right? Where's the data about shut-ins? That's in production, right?
Right.
So where's your production data? Right? How is that production data, specifically in this case, well status, and not just well status, but as of last change, right? Because you need to know how long has that property been shut in,
Right.
not just is it or isn't it shut in.
No.
So there's another subtle piece of information there which isn't always stored in the production system, which is date of last status change. So well status starts to become a really important component to this, as well as if you look at leases in the secondary term, right, where that status is really important, that we pay attention to that. We also look at production and paying quantities, right? It depends on where your assets are, and how they came into the company and things like that. But there's more data that needs to make its way into the land admin umbrella, which we don't see, generally speaking, a good process for. If we look in typical upstream firms, it's like land's got to go beat down, and they're busy trying to grow production and hit their forecast, and holding leases is just not part of their box, and that's what you guys do, and so they're not maybe always aware of what data points you guys need and that sort of thing. So, and then the idea is make sure that you have some sort of proactive risk process or notification. Now, it could be automated, it could be manual, but it starts with awareness, and then you've got to track it, right? So what are the types of things that you might actually track? Some express and implied covenants here. Cessation of production. This is exactly what you just asked about, right? Wells on this, the only operating well on this property has been shut in for 90 days. How long, what is our strategy as a company? Where are we in this lease? What are our options in terms of either making payments or changing operations or doing some sort of topside activities, depending on the language in this lease, that might qualify us to hold the lease, right? All of that's going to depend. But we talked about specifically well status reason. Sometimes the well status is shut in, but that's not even enough because you need to know why is it shut in. Is it shut in for some sort of stimulation project? That's an okay shut in, or is it shut in just because we determined it wasn't economic to produce it? So there's all sorts of different, and there's another dozen reasons, right, why one might be shut in. Continuous drilling, we touched on that a little bit. Sometimes you'll see, all sorts of varieties of these continuous operations clauses with or without deferment days. If you drill 2 wells within 180 days, then you don't have to drill another one until 60 days after the last activity, rig release date, etc. Production paying quantities, offset wells, right? If there are wells going in around the periphery of your acreage positions, how do you become aware of those? What is your response process to offset liabilities in these close-in shale positions? This is another thing that we've never seen someone who's really on top of this, who says, wow, we have a great way of A, becoming aware of an offset need, and B, having a practice to go in and address that proactively. Marketing provisions, again, data that you have. Does your lease require you to pay royalties on the highest marketed price within the county? Are you actually even following up with that? Or are you just putting them in the standard royalty check payment system and they just get the check like everybody else? You think about things that are likely to cause sort of litigious type activities if you were a landowner. And then minimum production targets. right? A lot of times leases will have minimum production targets where that data is just not in the land department, right? You have to go and get all of these. That's the common thread here is all of this is dependent on data that's not inside of the land database or tracked inside of land. So there's got to be a process which sort of takes us to the third best practice, which is if you say, well, that's just, we have no choice, we can't get to this information, then you're sort of just accepting the default, and you're accepting kind of, don't be surprised when you get the phone call from the attorney about this lease that's in jeopardy now, or an upset landowner, whatever, but it slows down operations, right? So even if the impact is just a degradation of your landowner relationships, right? That's not going to help you further exploit that property, or you need another drill site, you need a friend in the neighborhood who's going to give you a pad site or work that out with you. So it's always good to have better to have good relationships. So I've covered this. No one department has the whole story. You need data from drilling, you need data from production, you need data from marketing, you need data from biz dev sometimes. There's all sorts of data. So we look at what are some clear things, pieces of information that are sort of obvious that you need to be focusing on. And here's some data from production: volume, status reason, status date, right? Last status change date, as of date. The drilling life cycle, again, depending on what are the triggers within that lease that trigger windows opening and closing for certain activities. You may need casing, perf, rig release, etc. Move on dates. And then depending on whether you're doing marketing, division of interest, sales data, LOE, etc. So, a case study that illustrates these kind of three best practices coming together. So, this is a client of ours. They have active operations in the Eagle Ford. They have other shale plays in different phases. They are somewhat active in A&D. I wouldn't say they're highly active, but that's definitely an aspect of their business. As 50% of the market probably is that's a component of the business. Land, there's a high degree of variability in their lease portfolio. There's no two leases alike, just a wide variety. And many of them are complex, are lengthy, complex leases. And their challenge was they were tracking these leases in a spreadsheet. And when we started in, they had already had some issues with timely, accurate payment of royalties. And that sort of was the kickoff point for this risk, meaning that brought to light some other problems in the company. And they said, wow, we're really in a bad place. If this were to become a larger problem, it could be really material to the business. And they realized that they really just had no visibility into compliance with some of these key material leases. So what was the process that we went through? So number one, we talked about doing this lease review. So that was a first step, right? Especially the ones that are material. I mean, it's a no-brainer in terms of the ROI. If you haven't reviewed your more material leases, to do that, enumerate any provisions that aren't being tracked but could trigger litigious activity or could trigger risk exposure. I'll just put that in general, risk exposure. And then defining what are the key input parameters to know whether or not risk might become part of the equation. Okay. Number two is data mapping. So now we know what are the drivers for risk based on the leasehold that we have. Where are these drivers located so that we can pay attention to them, right? So it's locating the systems of record. Okay, so if I need rig release date, where is that in my company, right? It's going to vary company to company. And then mapping into those systems, mapping those data points into some sort of destination so that you can regularly have access to this data without having to go bug someone and drill it. Next is data cleansing. After we located all these data points, what we found is that A, they're stored in multiple systems in some cases, and B, they disagree. So one system says the well's shut in, another one says it's producing, another one says it's in test, another one says it's actively drilling because it just never got updated, right? So the problem with this is that these statuses, as you just questioned, drive behavior and drive risk if you're not paying attention to them. And so what we find is data quality then, you can integrate systems, but if the data's poor, it's garbage in, garbage out. So we had to go and do a cleanup of some of this data. In fact, this actually became a project within a project, was the data cleanup of this critical information. And well status actually became one of the big items of pain, because it's not just a machine problem, it's a human problem, which is when I say a well is shut in, what does that mean? And different stakeholders have sort of look at that from different angles and say, well, but this is a special case, and what about this special case? And we had to sort of work through all of the human element of well status. I'll say one more thing about well status, which is that's an interesting consideration. Which it isn't like there's one system that holds the official well status. At different phases of an asset's life cycle, status may be owned, if you will, by a different department. So during the drilling phase, who's likely to have the most accurate status information? Then during production, well then, later on in the life cycle, where does that live? In other words, where do we place our trust that has the best information? And that actually moves over time. So the next step was to link these systems and synchronize into a master copy that was determined to be the authoritative set of these properties. And then cross-referencing now, so we know we have a master set of all these inputs that we said could trigger risk based on the lease portfolio that we had. And we now have this master set in one location. So the last step is to cross-reference these with our sort of provision inventory, and then look at which of them are potential problems. And then, lastly, is now that we have this report, so to speak, dashboard that can tell us where our potential problems could be, actually looking forward, meaning you're within 15 days of a continuous operations window, right? Knowing that in advance, as opposed to you just missed a continuous operations window, right? Now the question is, how do we create process around that so that we can act on this? And as we bring in new leases to the company, how do we make sure that they go back through the same process so that we have a living process rather than a point in time? We solved it and then it just got away from us again over time.
Just a question real quick.
Yes, sir.
It's just because, is Insurance just the software program, or do y'all also do the input of data management?
So we're a consulting company.
Okay.
We don't sell a product.
Okay.
Right. What we would help you do is manage the project, and then we actually are the implementers as well. Okay. So we would build the solution, but we would provide some of the subject matter expertise as well as the experience across, peer firms and what other people are doing to deal with this type of issue.
Okay.
Is that clear? Did anyone else have did I answer that question for everybody? Okay. So the last step is the alerts, which is, there's two steps here, which is, for different assets, who needed to know about what types of risks when, right, and how far in advance. As opposed to before, when we came in, it was all funneling through one landman, and then he would decide, I need to call so-and-so, I need to check with so-and-so, I need to get a meeting with so-and-so. Now it was a little more open-ended. We could go right to the person who was responsible, or who could actually go and affect the change, or call together the people who needed to make the decision. And so assigning who's the business owner, when this alert gets triggered, who should receive that, and then what are the sensitivity cases? So how far in advance would you want to be notified? Not so far that it's annoying, but not so short time that I have no ability to even react. Right, so finding what are those, how sensitive are we to different aspects of these different leases, and then when would we want to know about it? So this is kind of what it looked like in the IT world, so this is for you, which is we had these systems, and we had these provisions, let's call it a provision database for lack of a better term, after that was a product of this lease review. Now these were, again, provisions that were sort of the non-standard ones that weren't being tracked, and didn't have an existing process. We're not talking about rentals, we're not talking about bonus payments, and it's things that are sort of standard operating procedure. So capturing these into a central system, syncing those key attributes into a compliance management system. There's some configuration, setting up the reports and alerts, and this really was kind of the lease compliance solution, kind of how it all fit together. This was a SQL Server with SharePoint, pretty standard, nothing exotic technology-wise. And these are typical department solutions, Excalibur and TOW and production access and, you know, the typical systems that you might see there. So the results are, we had this ability to track different aspects that we didn't really have visibility into before. We were able to get, you know, out of the Excalibur Lease Master notes field, it was like just a paragraph of specialty provisions that were just like notated in a notes field. Those now actually are alive and cause activity to happen based on their actual trigger dates and real data flowing in from operations. So big change there. And we're able to take the spreadsheet on a landman's laptop, which he was glad to he was like, I feel like I'm holding dangerous dynamite here. He was glad to sort of have a system take over for that and be a stakeholder in the system as opposed to being the person owning this responsibility. So that's it. This tells you a little, answers sort of your question in a little more detail, who we are as a company. We're not a reseller of a particular product. Whereas we work with P2, we work with Merrick, we work with Landmark, we work with Schlumberger, we work with IHS. We're not reselling or we're not selling a particular product. We're a consulting company. We're not a staff aug firm, so we're not renting out people. We don't use subcontractors. So, and we're headquartered here in Houston. So, after that, we were really want to open it up to just group discussion, and I'll sit down and we can rehash it again. I think that what we found in prior lunch and learns is that this portion of kind of having lunch and discussing the topic a lot of times creates a lot of cross sharing between different firms on the topic, and you know we're glad to observe and chime in where it makes sense, but we're really interested to hear what you guys think.
Have you worked a lot with P2, or what is an example like you've done with a company that has P2?
Almost all of our clients run something from P2.
Okay, well, yeah, Excalibur.
So that was with Excalibur.
Between Excalibur and Bolo.
They did that, yeah, we were on Bolo, of course, so you work with them.
And then Enterprise
I
Upstream.
don't understand, you don't
So
sell.
EU is their Oracle product.
Yes. You don't sell a system.
So what we sell is, so you imagine the professional services of a company like a P2 or a Landmark.
Yes.
We're like that unbolted from the product sale.
Okay.
So we don't advocate or push a particular product. We only work for the customer, and we're versed in what you would normally find in a typical upstream company. So the 3 or 4 most common production accounting tools, the 3 or 4 most common ERPs, the 3 or 4 most common drilling daily reporting systems, the 3 or 4 most common land administration systems. That's sort of from a coverage perspective. You know, we've integrated, customized, built reports on top of, made dashboards, done business intelligence systems. We're sort of a value add on top of the product, right?
And so that way we're agnostic in terms of how
Could
we
you go
work.
back to your
Oh.
picture that had the, where you were sort of showing your solution and your big green box ended up there?
This one?
Yeah, at the end of this. Okay, so you've done this amazing cleaning and cleansing and scrubbing and figuring.
Yes,
You've
we've
brought
waved the
in-
magic wand of
You've
IT.
brought in all of the solutions, and you've got these sort of non-standard things that you've identified for this particular company,
Uh-huh.
and your whole magic happens today. So when they bring in their next big acquisition,
Good question.
what is their process at that point? Because they're now inheriting, you know,
Hundreds.
1,800
Right,
new
sure.
leases
New
with their
leases
own
that
sets
they
of
didn't write.
special things that they had nothing to do with. Maybe it came over on Bolo, maybe it didn't. Maybe there's lots of things that are typed into that notes field and have no other.
And you go read, and maybe the lease was read last by a human being 6 years ago, right?
whatever, you know, I mean,
And
and
that-
so.
No one knows who that person was.
So for your sample.
Are the notes even
company here-
accurate?
Right.
You know?
Or his spreadsheet got wiped away whenever he left. the
Well, and
company.
let's even assume
Or
that
left
they,
on a
that they
laptop
had,
that it
they
came
had
in
a
on.
compatible system, and the notes come over, and they actually were reasonably well done, and you have a staff of lease analysts who look at it and say, yep, yep,
This is
yep.
great, okay.
But
Even so.
it's still stuck in this notes field, it's
Yeah.
still not been incorporated into your compliance system. What's the process for that company at that point?
So what we've talked about is having a lease onboarding process. So you think about how you would onboard a new employee, right? There's a certain set of paperwork, certain set of data points you need to capture, and there's kind of a queue of people that they need to go and visit as they come into an organization. And we like to think about lease onboarding as no different. Rather than, here's a box of leases, or more like a truckload of lease paperwork, figure it out, that there's actually a defined process to onboard new assets. And
what you put together, for instance, specifically with these special provisions, would give a place for something that's coming in and new to the company to plug in,
so,
or no.
so the idea is, so the main thing that needs to happen is that the provisions would need, you guys, by the way, don't wait for me, I have to order separately, but the main thing that you need, that is the gap when you have the system in place is really this top piece, right? It's itemizing the lease provisions in this new body of leases, as it were. And so you really need a systematic way to create a queue of leases that are subject to review. Now, whether you're reviewing the actual document, digital document, or just the notes field, and cross-checking it with the document, you're doing some form of review. And some of this may have been done during due diligence, right? So you may already have some of this information, especially around material production, where, hopefully during due diligence you would have realized some of this risk was out there, although that's not a perfect system. But really what you need is an onboarding process. We actually created sort of a proof of concept, like a mock-up of what that might look like. I actually don't have it because this is my laptop. I might actually have a video capture of what that would look like. It's just a proof of concept.
And I guess maybe I'm just getting too deep into it, but for instance,
Are
she
you
mentioned
talking
she's
about-
Bolo, we're on Bolo.
You're talking about data matching.
You know,
that won't get into the
as
box.
the stuff, as those non-traditional things come in, if
Yeah.
it's not being tagged within Bolo, where are you, and it's not in somebody's, it's not in Jeffrey's spreadsheet on his laptop,
Right.
where are we actually capturing
So,
that?
So this little cube in the middle here
Mhm.
is illustrating actually a new database.
Okay.
And the only new information that's stored there. So this central repository actually stores two kinds of data. One is copies of the authoritative set of key attributes that we need to monitor, right? The feeder attributes, the inputs to our clauses that we're tracking. The other thing is an actual inventory of provisions by lease.
Okay.
So there's actually a database that holds that inventory of provisions in a structured way, as opposed to free-form text like a notes field
Okay.
that says, okay.
And that's where you're then able to generate your alerts.
And there's actually a user interface that we surfaced through their SharePoint, through their intranet, that would allow people with proper security privileges to go and enumerate new provisions.
Okay.
And then it would actually draw from the lease master, so they could actually link it by the lease number or various other ways, of course, without getting too detailed. But they actually would link it to their lease master, so it would be the Bolo lease master in your case, but whether it's Caliber or whatever. But some way to actually say, oh, here's a lease, how many provisions have been defined? Oh, none, because we just acquired this as part of our package. So, what we actually showed in the kind of proof of concept that we put together for the onboarding system. So just in full disclosure, this onboarding system is not something that's in production, but this conversation did come up, which is, okay, we're set for what we have today, but let's say we go out, and this company wasn't, unlike Memorial, isn't doing an acquisition every 6 weeks. So they don't quite have the
We
same.
don't wait 6 weeks.
You don't wait 6 weeks. 18 months, 18 deals.
Wow.
You know,
But you're not trying to
their
duplicate
concern
what's
wasn't
in
so like
Bolo,
urgent,
but
like
you
we
have-
got to have a go forward, you know, for the next acquisition. But at the same time, we did talk about, you know, what would that look like, and basically it would be some additional user interface where when they import these, create these new leases in Bolo or in their case with Excalibur, they'd be identified with a certain status that would say they haven't been reviewed yet. And then you'd go in the provisions tracking system, and we should call it LPT in this case, the LPT database, lease provision tracking database. And you would either mark them as they're reviewed and everything is standard, meaning there's no exotic stuff to track, but at least you can say, yes, it's been reviewed and we can confirm that someone has actually looked at it, versus it's there with nothing and who knows. Or they would say, it's been reviewed and here are the 3 provisions that we need to track, and they would actually define them out. And then the next step is, there may be an approval process, meaning someone needs to validate that, yes, in fact, that it is a 60-day continuous operations clause with 90 deferment days for every
And all
well
of that
drilled.
supplements but doesn't replace what Bolo already holds in its
No,
standard
exactly.
tracking.
Yeah, and in fact, that's you know, what Bolo holds out of the box is an important source of information, just like production, or which is when was the lease executed, and what was the length of the primary term, and where is it today, and have there been any changes to it over time, and so that becomes this land cylinder that you see over here on the left, right? That would be your Bolo land system, which is it's also an important source of data, and we're not looking to duplicate or replace that in any way. This is really about, because if it already did it, you just use that. We'd say lunch would be very short. We just say use Bolo or use Excalibur, game over. But it really varies from company to company. It's one challenge that even a P2 would have a hard time building an out-of-the-box system for every lease that could be contemplated over the course of time. And depending on the landman and the attorneys that drafted it and when it was drafted, and it's just so many variables, right? So they could cover kind of the 80%, but this 20% is material, is what we've seen. That this other 20% can really bite you and generate friction, time, distraction.
So did you use SharePoint as an interface?
Yes, that's sort of what the user sees.
Right.
is a SharePoint interface.
And were the alerts triggered by SharePoint?
So we actually didn't use SharePoint.
Sorry about the technical.
No.
There you go.
Well, that's true. We got to apologize for the IT conversation.
Yeah.
We didn't actually use SharePoint alerts because they weren't
They're
configurable
pretty
enough.
awkward. Yeah.
They do a certain thing, and for basic stuff like tell me when this document changes or when this list item changes, but they weren't configurable enough for the business rules that we needed.
Mm-hmm.
So you could have used, for example, you could have used a K2 or an Intex, like a workflow product, but this was unique enough that we just created the alert system as a custom app. It was a minor amount of code. It wasn't like we're building this big alert system.
And then what did you do for the scanned documents?
So
How did
in
you
this
tie them
case,
to
this company did not have digitized lease records.
Oh, okay.
Not with enough coverage that it would have made sense to pull in. In the proof of concept that we did, we actually show a tie-in to the digital lease repository where each provision can be linked to an exact page of an exact document.
Oh,
Meaning,
beautiful.
when you go pull it up and you want to say, well, this supposedly has this type of provision, when I click on that, it actually pulls the lease and shows me the page and the paragraph that has that provision.
So you don't have to search through it.
Exactly.
That's beautiful.
Once you've done the review, right, like why go make someone else re-thumb through that lease
That's right.
looking for that language? Somewhere in this lease there's this sentence that I'm looking for. Why not just, once that's been done, if you captured that data, then you'd have it for all time. You'd always
So
be
could
able
you
to-
page forward and back on it? So it's
The
part
idea-
of the PDF, but it takes you to the page,
I
correct?
tell you what, if I think I actually have a video, but I have to swap out
That's pretty sweet.
machines to show you just the idea that we created. It'll take me a couple minutes. But yes, that's the idea, is that you have a side-by-side. So in the sort of onboarding step, you'd show a side-by-side view of the lease if you had it digitized, and a sort of set of provisions. And then if you wanted to create a new one, you'd say, okay, create a minimum royalty provision, or create a whatever, continuous drilling provision. And then you'd say, okay, what are the parameters? Okay, it's triggered on rig release date, and you have this window before this other date has to hit, right? We have to have a move-on date, or we have to have, again, you can sort of define, like in this lease, the language is specific as to this type of activity is what's considered drilling or operations or whatever that the lease language is in that case, right? Because it might actually vary, and you'll need, and that's really the expertise of the land department, is knowing how to interpret that language into, okay, this is the key date based on this lease, or our attorneys have decided that this is the date that we're going to measure on. Right. So that's something that we don't do, which is tell you how your leases should be interpreted. Right? We leave that to the experts, but we help you give you a place to put that information and a way to sort of be aware of what could be going on. Let's see if I have this.
And I guess most alerts would be email.
Yes. So we use email as the primary, and then we would attach a report or something with more background information to it, like a report that showed, okay, the reason you're getting this alert is not just, hey, lease in jeopardy with this lease ID. It was this clause of this lease, or you might have, what we found is it was better to aggregate them rather than sending one at a time emails. To like say, here's the 3 things that came up today. Right, this lease on this tract, right, you get some information about the lease, and then what's the provision on it, and then why does it alert it? Okay, you now moved within the yellow sensitivity for this provision, which again, that's defined by your land admin group. How concerned are we about these different types of provisions? And then it just runs their program, more or less, right? They say, this is our level of sensitivity, and this is the alert logic, meaning if this thing gets triggered, this person needs to get an alert. And if it goes more days, then maybe you go up the food chain a notch, right? You can escalate programmatically up the org chart or to a higher level, a higher level supervisor or something like that as you get, whatever the company's defined as, these are risks that we're concerned about. As that looks more likely to be realized, you want to sort of raise the flag a little higher, right? Let me see. And minimum production, I'm guessing MP. And here you can see the different days, deferment days, when does this go into effect, when does it expire.
And this is how you then link it to the page for
Exactly.
searchability later? Okay.
Exactly. And then this is, so he's showing a review of someone. So this is after a set of provisions has been logged on a lease and it's been submitted as these are the ones. Someone else is coming in and reviewing, and then approving or rejecting with a comment. So you saw that we just left a comment and rejected that minimum production thing as it wasn't the right number of days or something like that. So now I think he's
highlighting that one turned red because he rejected it.
Because it has a rejected
That's right.
provision on it.
So that rejection note is tied to that PDF?
Exactly. You're saying, we're rejecting this clause because maybe when I'm reviewing, you said it was this type of provision with these parameters, and when I look at it, I don't read it that way, right? So there's a conversation that needs to take place. Again, no system is going to automate the interpretation of leases. Really, that's really what we want the subject matter experts working on.
Absolutely.
But can we capture in a way that's meaningful to the business whatever that determination is, so that they're not rereading it or
And accelerate the
re-explaining
review
it
process.
or re-reviewing it
Or spending
6
time
months,
finding the clause.
18 months, or you want to go now spin this asset off and due diligence, you're going to have to go re-review all your releases. Imagine if you had this going into that, even on a divestiture, right? And having this data to be able to go and show. So you can see some stats on this person's queue, how many unread leases they have, so many unreviewed, how many read, approved, So this is someone, so we made the ability to like either upload a PDF, because some people don't have like a database of digitized leases. They just have or create a link, meaning you don't want to create another copy of this file. It's already on some drive or a SharePoint or something like that. We just want to hyperlink to it. And it will render the lease, whether it will render the PDF or the document, regardless of whether it pulls it over a link or it has it actually stored in a database. I mean, this is administration, creating people, assigning leases to them, setting permissions.
Was pink good or bad on that? No, it wasn't red. I know red's not good.
So you can see there's just a drag and drop to assign. You can just drag a lease over and drop it on a user.
Profiles.
Creating new users, whether they actually are in a reviewer role or an approver role.
So is your area of expertise, are you all more IT or are you ex-land man?
If I had to pick between those two, we're more IT.
So where'd you build your knowledge of land?
Working in the oil and gas business for 10 years.
Doing what?
Working with data and software and processes and that kind of thing.
But solving business problems first and not starting it with IT groups.
Yeah.
I started the company a little over 10 years ago,
Uh-huh.
and Spinnaker Exploration was
Yeah.
one of my first customers. It was my first customer. Partners with Newfield on some projects.
John Kelly Barnes?
Yeah, of course. He knows me. Yeah. Roger Jarvis wrote my recommendation to the Petroleum Club when he was president of the Petroleum Club.
So you spun off and formed this company?
So they were my first customer. So I started this company then, and we built from there. You didn't get a chance to see our kind of list of customers, but list of upstream clients.
So I'd be interested in hearing what was asked earlier about shut-ins, like how do you address shut-ins?
Because that's been a problem everywhere I've ever been.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
So
What's your solution? I mean, we've actually lost leases, so
Yeah.
yeah,
you're talking about mitigating risk, so
yeah,
as
exactly.
we try to, I need to know what your solution is, because, I mean, driving this, I won't have an hour, but get right to the, through the chase.
Yeah, I
What can
understand.
you do that we can't do, or that I can't call up P2 as a mid-sized E&P company and say, I need you to fix this?
Yeah.
And-
So the challenge is,
or in our
so
land
what
department tell the land guys they need to fix this. So what do you do to my
do you
landscape?
run for production at Newfield?
What do we run for production?
Yeah. What application?
I don't know what application. I have no idea. I'm land
And
based.
so that's the challenge right there, right?
I don't
The
know.
challenge is that the real data that you need is not in land. It's in production.
It's
Yeah, it
not,
probably is.
P2 can't get it far as I know.
Right? It's in
It's
production,
separate-
and
separate
it's an
database.
integration problem, which is
Yeah.
why P2 is not the best answer.
It's an integration.
We're an
and a
integrator.
Yeah.
communication problem, it's both.
So we're
You're
an integrator.
That's right.
Okay.
So if you were in the Microsoft ecosystem, right, which is, so I only reference that because it's the largest ecosystem of software consulting companies out there. We're considered an integrator, meaning we don't create first-party software. We're not selling you a out of the box. It's $10,000 per user.
Right.
You know, we're consultants, right? And what we help you do is tie the data across your different systems together and produce the reports that you need. And we create dashboards and that sort of thing.
Okay. And so, I'm sorry. Let's get back to the shut-in. How do you address shut-ins? Let's just
So
take an example.
so our opinion on it, I would have to sort of put a lot of parentheses around this in that it's going to depend. Right? So the first answer is it depends. But I think that the biggest challenge that we see across clients that we talk to around well status in general, but shut-in in particular, okay, is that the people don't agree on what it is. And so, of course, what you find when you look in the systems is the systems don't agree. Right? And so you want to know whether or not a well shut in, but if I could look at 3 different databases in your company and they argue, even the databases say this one says it's shut in and this one says it's not, how are the people supposed to know? Right? So it's data quality and it's establishing the rule of what is shut in for the purposes of, and that's the key element for shut in. For the purposes of administrating a lease, shut in means blah. right? In other words, land administration may say, we don't care about wells that are shut in for this reason, only wells that are shut in for these reasons, right? So that's step one. Step two is, okay, where is that shut-in code that we can go and look at? Oh, you don't have access, that's in production access, or that's in Merit Pro Count, or that's in tow, or that's in some Schlumberger system, right? Any number of different ones could be from Schlumberger. So the challenge is that data is not stored in land. It's stored somewhere else, and it's very dynamic, especially shut-in, right? Well, it can shut in and then not be shut in. It can happen more than once a day. So, I mean, depending on that offshore, I mean, that's all, right? It's very highly variable. So you need to shut in, and then why is it shut in? And then you have to agree as a company around consistency about what those rules are. And then who can set the shut-in code? Because if we're going to say lease jeopardy is a potential consequence of mislabeling a shut-in, we need to make sure that data is right. So what can we do? Because there's a clear cost that we can put a box around and say that was the cost, right? So how important is it that data be right? And then how important is it that it be communicated to land? Well, and what we see is no one makes it important that it's right, and no one makes it important that it's communicated to land. So they'll ask to know, but they're the ones charged with administering leases. Anadarko's website describes land administration as the department charged with protecting the company's assets.
Yeah.
That's the posting of their land administration job. And yet, we see an under-tooled land administration workforce. They have the subject matter expertise. Right? It's not that they don't know how to read a lease or how to administer. They don't have the information necessary to do the job properly because the information is not in land.
What I see interest doing is, in my interpretation, and you can please correct me, is that I see you coming in doing an evaluation of what we have, we at Contango, what we have first. And then you go back and then you figure it out like the production has software that integrates with Bolo, but we just never knew it. And so your company comes in and says, hey, by the way, guys, you have this, you didn't know it. Kind of like me and my uncle conversation, real quick. I was in there one day and I pushed a button. He goes, what'd you do? I turned on the seat warmer. He goes, I had seat warmers in my car?
Right.
And I went, yeah, and your seat reclines too. He goes, my seat reclines?
You're right.
It's like, why are you driving a Mercedes? Why don't you just drive a Buick? But the problem is he didn't know. This is what he does. He takes the instruction manual and he uses it.
Yeah.
And am I right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I like that.
the analysis is important. So that part is
And all-
definitely.
with all- Forgive me for asking hard questions, I'm just going through the chase, but all due respect, isn't that what IT's for? Isn't that why I have an IT department to tell me what you're telling me? I mean, I don't mean.
Well, no,
Let me-
that's a business issue.
See,
Okay.
and see, really, it's a hybrid, right?
Yeah.
It's really a hybrid here, and that's the challenge that we see is even into larger independents,
Yeah.
right? Is that IT's about we're going to provide you the platform, but the business rules and who gets alerted and when IT doesn't make those decisions. And you're saying, well, if we don't have the systems we need, isn't that a problem of IT? And IT's thinking, well, no one's come and asked us for a
I
system,
guess.
right?
So
And
then there's this kind of into perpetuity, we're just waiting.
Oh, don't get me
and-
wrong, this is us. I mean,
I think it's
we're not.
It's everywhere.
I mean, confessions of a, mid-sized independent.
We
We're not
just
talking.
don't have any visibility.
We don't work
into what
with
you need to
business
see.
I'd like to see your, I'd like to see your, if you don't mind, would you put
Oh.
up your list of clients so I could, it's not in here.
Yeah, sure.
If
It's
I
harder
could-
for us to put on a piece of paper to distribute, if that makes sense.
Okay. And who,
Well-
are you with Intran?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
We've got 100 people in land, let's see, we've got 102, 104 in land administration, so why don't, and we have a whole.
Well, the gap, in IT,
department.
most IT people are technology, I'm into SQL and all this. They're not really business process people.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think the
Oh, you
biggest gap in
Geez, there's some big
companies.
companies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you guys, Stat Oil is huge, that's more than a mid-sized independent. I'm not sure.
We work.
Sheridan,
I'm not sure.
Lisa Stewart.
Yeah, that was.
She used to be an Apache.
Yes.
Probably, I need to
And
update
former
that
El Paso,
And El Paso.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah,
Before
that's
then,
the management team
Apache.
of Sheridan, both El Paso folks,
Oh.
EP.
At Castec, did you work with Steve Taylor?
I don't know Steve Taylor at
He was my manager.
Castex. So Castex became a client when Phoenix sold part to Apache
Right.
and part to Castex. Right? They sort of went in jointly on part of the assets, and then and so we've dealt mostly with the production operations team at Castex, not the land team.
In Freeport background, were you dealing with planes or with Freeport?
With the Plains folks.
Yeah. Is that Steve Lafruz?
I'm working on the exploration and development side.
Okay. I know mainly the.
No, sure.
It's just about calling any of these people, to ask them.
Well, the larger firms are, I mean, again, when you work for them, a lot of times you're working for a department or a point of tangency between two departments. Like, the projects don't tend to be a complete corporate re-engineering of the well life cycle, right, at certain levels, right? At an independent, a smaller independent, that would be, and we can show you how at Statoil Hydro, actually before the Statoil merger at Norsk Hydro, we did a full well life cycle documentation of like which systems does the well live in over the course of its asset period.